They never landed. That's what frightened us most, not because we wished for invasion, but because we expected it. For decades, all our science fiction and prophecy predicted the same pattern: signs in the sky, radio signals, descending ships, contact or conquest. But they never arrived in that way. They didn't declare their presence with fire or light or a sound we could understand. They watched. And they waited. And somehow that was infinitely more terrifying. They were already here long before we even learned to split the atom or send our first golden record into space. In fact, by the time we started looking outward, they had already studied our biology, our history, our myths, and even our fears, especially our fears. The only thing they hadn't fully understood was what we might become if we ever noticed them. I was only 9 when the first whispers began. At first, it was the stars. Not their positions, but their behavior. Whole constellations, subtly shimmering at wrong frequencies. Telescopes picked up background noise from specific coordinates. Too regular, too rhythmic. Not language, not a signal. Something deeper, a kind of presence. Then came the disappearances. Entire deep space probes stopped transmitting, not destroyed, not hijacked, just gone. Satellites went blind. Black boxes filled with static. But nothing was ever found. No debris, no flare, no sign of aggression, just silence. And that's what terrified the astronomers more than anything, because whatever was out there didn't want to talk. It just wanted to see what we'd do. My father was one of the first to obsess over it. He wasn't a scientist, not in the institutional sense. He was a cryptographer with an addiction to the unknown. For him, this wasn't just astronomy. It was an equation waiting to be solved, a logic hidden in plain sight. He used to sit on our old farmhouse porch in the Midwest, listening to the stars like a monk listens for God. "They're not trying to talk," he once said. "They're listening to see if we can hear." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, decades later, I know he was right. And I think he knew that by the time the watching became more than passive, it would already be too late to stop what was coming. In 2046, everything changed. That was the year the deep-orbit vessel Calliope returned, except it didn't come back the way it left. It re-entered Earth orbit 3 days earlier than scheduled, with no communication, no tracking trail, and no astronauts. Just one file left in its black box log. A video loop of static with a single embedded phrase. "You are not alone, but you are not yet ready." No trace of the crew. No biological matter. No energy signature. Only an eerie low hum captured by the instruments. Something resembling a heartbeat, but not human. The governments buried the event under layers of classified protocol, but the truth leaked through in fragments. By then, I was old enough to understand what I'd always felt in my bones. We were never the top of the food chain, never the center of the cosmos. We were a project. A variable in someone else's experiment. The next few years brought a surge of anomalies. Birds migrating in perfect geometric formations. Whales beaching at equidistant intervals across continents. Ice shelves collapsing in rhythmic pulses like planetary arrhythmia. Nature was being calibrated, as if someone or something was fine-tuning Earth like an instrument. That's when the dreams began. They weren't normal dreams. They weren't mine. All over the world, thousands reported identical visions, an ocean of stars peeling back to reveal a vast, staring eye. No iris. No pupil. Just a void that watched without blinking. Without judgment. People who'd never met from different nations and languages drew the same symbols. Circular fractals. Interlocking helixes. Strange runes that didn't match any known script but carried a weight, a vibration, a kind of mental gravity. My own dreams became infected too. I would wake in a cold sweat whispering words I didn't know. I started sketching the same patterns my father once drew before he disappeared. Yes, disappeared. Not died. Not missing. Just gone. Like Calliope's crew. Now, as I sit in the ruins of what used to be the National Deep Space Listening Post, I remember his final warning. It was scrawled into the wall of his study in chalk in a language no living person had ever spoken. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Loosely translated, it meant, the ones who do not speak are louder than gods. And as I look toward the night sky, I feel them listening. Not just to our words or our machines, but to our thoughts, our patterns, our hunger for knowledge. They wait until we become loud enough, not with sound, but with evolution. They watched us from the deep sky not because they feared us, but because they remembered a time before us and something about our shape, our thirst, our anger, our beauty. Reminds them of something they once lost. Or perhaps something they once feared. And tonight, for the first time in 100,000 years, they begin to move. The sky didn't change overnight, but we did. Not in ways you could immediately see, not in our bones or skin or speech, but in the way we felt when we looked up. It was like an itch under our thoughts, a kind of static behind the soul. The knowing. We had proof now, not just belief or stories or blurry lights in the sky. Something had touched one of our ships, sent it back hollow and haunted, and left behind nothing but a single phrase we couldn't explain. You are not alone, but you are not yet ready. Most people didn't understand the weight of those words. But those of us who did felt the ground beneath us tilt ever so slightly. As if the planet itself had just become aware of being observed. It wasn't long before the changes began to accelerate, not in them, but in us. At first, it was the dreams. Then the compulsions. People across the globe began waking with strange bruises in perfect geometric patterns. Not injuries, not random, but symbols as if they had been pressed into the skin by some invisible force during sleep. One girl in Ukraine spoke in fluent Akkadian for 7 minutes after collapsing in a field of iron ore. An elderly man in Sao Paulo carved a 200-foot spiral into the concrete courtyard of an abandoned prison using only a shard of broken mirror. No one saw him enter or leave. He vanished before the footage could be reviewed. And everywhere, those same dreams, visions of a silent cosmos cracking open like an eye, the sense of being pulled forward by something enormous and ancient and utterly patient. I was working for the Global Pattern Anomaly Division by then. Not officially, of course. The agency didn't exist on paper. But it had funding, personnel, and a mandate that scared even the deep state spooks. Track, decode, and contain all signs of emergent non-human intelligence or influence. We weren't just studying aliens, we were preparing for a truth too big for civilization to survive. And our data streams told a chilling story. The signals from deep space weren't random but harmonic. They echoed the frequencies of brainwave states, theta, delta, specifically those triggered during dreaming and altered consciousness. In short, something was hacking the collective unconscious of humanity. We found traces of what we called cognitive signatures, complex sequences hidden in human behavior patterns, hidden in stock market fluctuations, in migratory shifts, in the syntax of poetry posted anonymously online. Someone or something was embedding messages in the choices we thought were our own. When mapped, these signatures formed fractals that extended beyond mathematics. They were topographies of thought, maps of cognition not from one mind, but from a species-level network. Humanity itself was becoming a conduit, a bridge, or perhaps a receptor. Then came the event we called the mirror bloom. At precisely 3:33 Universal Time Coordinated, every reflective surface across a 200-mile radius in northern Chile became opaque mirrors, lenses, water, even polished metal. For 13 minutes, the surfaces shimmered with a non-visible spectrum that registered only on quantum-level sensors. And when they cleared, every reflective object now held a different reflection, not of the world around it, but of a cold, black ocean under a violet sky. The same sky hundreds of dreamers had described independently across cultures. No one could explain it. No one could deny it. That was the moment the world shifted from doubt to dread. Religions split. Governments panicked in silence. Scientists retreated into equations they no longer trusted. And I couldn't sleep anymore. Not because of fear, but because I started seeing the other side without closing my eyes. Every time I blinked, I glimpsed a horizon where structures moved slowly in the darkness like leviathans, crawling across the skin of an ancient star. And always, the sense that we were being judged not for what we had done, but for what we might become. What terrified us most wasn't invasion. It was integration. We weren't being conquered. We were being rewritten, reshaped. Our consciousness was being bent like metal beneath heat, folded toward a pattern too vast to decipher. The human mind wasn't being destroyed. It was being absorbed. And through all of it, they said nothing. No transmission. No code. No voice. Just watching. Listening. Recording the way our minds cracked and reformed under the weight of awareness. One night, I drove to the old coordinates where my father had vanished, the farmhouse long since buried under federal cement. I sat in the ruins, staring at the stars, waiting for nothing in particular. And then I felt it, not with my senses, but with something deeper. A presence behind the atmosphere, a shape behind the idea of a sky. I knew then that they had never arrived. They had always been here, in a different frame of time, a slower vibration of space. We'd been walking through their garden like blind children and only now had the veil begun to thin. A wind picked up. Not from the east or west, but from a direction I couldn't name. The grass bent in spirals and my shadow stretched away from my feet into impossible angles. I heard a sound I can't describe, not a tone, not a word, but a permission. And in that moment I understood what they were waiting for. Not technology. Not enlightenment. Permission. The moment we stopped looking outward and turned inward, the moment we began to listen instead of scream, that's when the door began to open. And something on the other side took a step forward. There was no announcement. No ship. No light. No apocalypse. Just a quiet unraveling of everything we thought we understood about reality. What came next wasn't war or revelation. It was evolution in slow motion, like watching a glacier move through human consciousness. First, the maps broke. Not the ones in our hands, but the ones in our heads. Magnetic poles flickered. Birds circled in endless spirals. Compasses became liars. GPS satellites recorded phantom continents that flickered on and off as if the Earth itself was glitching beneath our feet. But it wasn't Earth that had changed. It was our perception of it. The geometry of thought had begun to shift. I remember the first time I saw a place that shouldn't exist. It was somewhere outside of White Sands, in a zone long closed to civilians. My clearance had been updated following what they called conscious resonance episodes. That's what they named people like me. The dream-linked. The witnesses. The touched. A polite label for minds that had become open doors. They sent me there to observe, to validate anomalies, as if staring into the impossible would somehow restore the normal. What I found was a desert bleeding into another dimension. There were trees made of glass, casting shadows in every direction. Insects that hovered without wings, humming in tones that mirrored human speech backwards. The air pulsed. The sky bent downward like a dome of ink rippling with thought. In the center of it all stood a monument. Not built, grown. It pulsed with bioluminescence and ancient mathematics, inscribed not in symbols, but in emotion. It wasn't something you read. It was something you felt, like a memory someone else gave you. And in that monument I understood they weren't just observing us. They were grafting something into our world. Our dimension. Our dream of existence was being rewritten mid-thought. I collapsed after 13 minutes. When I woke, my watch had stopped. My camera had melted. But in my hand was a sphere, smooth, black, and impossibly cold. It vibrated subtly in my palm like it had a heartbeat. We analyzed it for weeks and nothing made sense. It was inert matter, carbon-based, but encoded with fractal sequences beyond quantum coherence. Every attempt to measure it changed the reading. The sphere didn't want to be understood. It wanted to be held. As if it were waiting for the right resonance. A matching mind. A key. That was the day I was removed from field duty and reassigned to isolation class A. Not because I was unstable, but because I had changed. My brain scans showed pattern formations never before recorded in human neurology, regions lighting up that weren't supposed to be active. My thoughts became nonlinear. I stopped dreaming. Instead, I started seeing places, beings, symbols, all woven together in a language I didn't learn but somehow remembered. I wrote down pages and pages of symbols. Fractals. Equations. None of them made sense until others, strangers, began doing the same. Independent of one another, all across the world. Same sequences. Same language. Same images. We were syncing. Not to each other, but to something else. The agency tried to suppress it at first. They called it neural contagion. A mass psychological event. But they knew better. We were being prepared. Aligned. Like tuning forks. And the sphere, it was one of many. All found by different people across different continents, drawn by instinct alone. One woman in Kyoto said the sphere called to her in silence. A child in Sierra Leone walked for 4 days straight, barefoot, to a field where one was buried beneath obsidian. No satellite had detected it. No metal signature. But the child knew. They all knew. As if a whisper had echoed through bloodlines for centuries, waiting for the right generation. And then came the first convergence. At 4:44 Universal Time Coordinated, all recorded dream-linked individuals fell unconscious within 3 seconds of each other. Across the globe. No warning. No explanation. I was one of them. During those 7 minutes, I saw everything. Not in visions, but in feeling. Time layered on itself like petals folding inward. Beings not made of flesh or form, but of memory and possibility. They stood in vast towers that grew like coral from the backs of dead stars. They did not speak, but they remembered us. Not individually, but collectively. Humanity wasn't a new discovery. We were a forgotten experiment, an echo, and they had returned not to claim us, but to complete us or to end us, if we had veered too far from the pattern. I woke up with blood running from my eyes and ears. I couldn't speak for 12 hours, but I could feel everything. Emotions that weren't mine. Longing, regret, curiosity. They were inside us now, gently, delicately. Not overtaking, not colonizing, listening, as if waiting to see what we'd do with the key they had placed in our hands. The question wasn't whether we were alone. The question was whether we were worthy of being remembered. And the answer, I feared, was still forming. Hidden somewhere inside us, waiting to be triggered by the right thought, the right choice, the right sound. The door had opened. And now we were the ones being watched from within. I started hearing the echoes first. Not in my ears, but in my decisions, tiny, insignificant choices that weren't mine anymore. A turn down a street I never meant to take. A word I'd never use slipping into conversation. A memory of something I had never experienced. And I wasn't alone. Those of us who'd been exposed to the sphere, who had touched it or even dreamed of it, were changing. Subtly, imperceptibly to outsiders, but undeniably from within. We were becoming mirrors. Receptors. Conduits for something far older than thought. They weren't just watching us now, they were folding into us. And we were letting them. The agency called it psychogenic echo modulation, a sterile term that meant nothing to the public. But inside the black hallways of the isolation network, we knew what it really was. Pre-adaptation. Not for space, not for some future war, but for coexistence. Or perhaps replacement. We were being overwritten in layers, like ink sinking beneath older words on a page. Not erased, just blended. And as this new pattern emerged within us, the world outside began to reflect that same quiet, shifting strangeness. Animals changed first. Dogs began to bark not at sound or motion, but at locations, empty corners of rooms, closets that hadn't been opened in years. Flocks of birds formed symbols in the sky we had seen in our dreams. Whales changed their songs to match fractals being carved into desert sand across multiple continents by unknown hands. But it wasn't behavior. It was synchronization. All life was bending toward the same shape the Earth itself responded. Geothermal pulses began resonating at specific frequencies, lining up with neurological activity in those carrying the so-called echo code. Volcanoes hummed. Oceans slowed. Gravity twisted just slightly, enough to make time dilate by a fraction of a second in certain zones. It was as if the entire planet had become part of a ritual, a stage being set for an arrival that wouldn't come with ships or fire, but with alignment. One of our own, Dr. Marisol Kentry, vanished after drawing a symbol over and over again across her cell wall. Not a symbol, a glyph. A living structure. It pulsed under ultraviolet light, expanding and contracting like breath. Then she disappeared. Surveillance showed nothing. One moment she was sitting there, staring at the wall. The next, the feed cut to static. Her badge and clothing remained, but she was gone. And etched into the concrete beneath her feet was a new glyph, one we had never seen before. It translated loosely, once decoded through resonance synthesis, to, "We remember the shape you used to be." That was when the dream-linked began reporting overlapping visions. Not dreams, not hallucinations, shared memories. Thousands of us across the planet experienced the same memory of walking through a hall made of glass, under a violet sun, surrounded by beings without mouths, speaking directly into our minds. We couldn't communicate back, but we felt what they felt. Hope, sorrow, anticipation. We were their forgotten kin, lost in the noise of entropy, now rediscovered. Not everyone accepted this transition. Resistance factions emerged, some calling themselves the true line, others the sovereigns of flesh. They claimed the changes were a virus, a soft invasion, a parasitic colonization of human soul. They tried to destroy the spheres, but they couldn't. The spheres didn't burn, didn't break, didn't react. They simply waited. One man detonated a high-yield device directly next to a sphere in a bunker outside Tel Aviv. His body was reduced to dust. The sphere remained, but the dust formed symbols on the walls before it faded. Language, warnings, maybe apologies. I started losing time. Moments skipping, hours vanishing. But when I came back, I had knowledge I never studied, languages I'd never heard. I began drawing maps of places no one had ever documented, star systems, constellations bent around gravitational anomalies. When cross-checked with theoretical astrophysics, they were accurate. Too accurate. I didn't understand what I was becoming. None of us did. But the question wasn't what we were changing into. The question was, who had we once been? That was the theory now whispered in dark labs and sealed bunkers, that we weren't being introduced to aliens but reintroduced. That these beings weren't strangers. They were us. Or what we were meant to be before time split us from the path. Before our species took a divergent branch, fracturing away from some vast, interlinked consciousness. And now they had returned not to conquer or save, but to recalibrate. Humanity wasn't the first version of ourselves. We were the forgotten backup of something greater, left in isolation to see if we could evolve back toward the light. And now the experiment was coming to an end. Time began to feel optional. That's the only way I can describe it. Not broken, not erased, just no longer necessary. Minutes folded inward. Days blurred. I'd catch myself remembering things that hadn't happened yet. Conversations I hadn't had. Visions of a sky that hadn't formed. I wasn't alone. All the witnesses, the dream-linked, the sphere-touched, the neuromapped, we were slipping out of sequence. But we weren't vanishing. No. We were being moved gently, deliberately into alignment with something else. Something outside chronology. The agency tried to contain us at first. We were quarantined in underground networks beneath Iceland, Australia, Siberia. They thought isolation would disrupt the pattern. But it didn't. The pattern was never spatial. It was relational. Once the thought had entered us, it didn't need proximity. It simply needed awareness. We were the medium now, and the message flowed through consciousness like current through copper. Resistance only made it stronger. The more we denied, the more it adapted. We weren't just becoming something else. We were remembering what we had been designed to forget. There was a moment, one that split me in two. I was standing in a corridor beneath Base State 9, reading transcripts from the Cairo Glyph Protocol, files recovered from a tomb that had never existed, under a temple that didn't appear on any map. The glyphs matched those on the spheres. Not similar. Identical. Carved thousands of years ago. Buried in time. And in one chamber, sealed with resin harder than diamond, was a mural. It depicted humans, clearly human, kneeling before beings of light whose heads were open like fractal spirals. No weapons. No violence. Just exchange. The beings gave something to us. Not objects. Not power. Thought. And behind them, a dark sky with a single enormous eye, half shut. I stared at that mural until something inside me shifted. My vision blurred. I fell to the floor, and I split. Not physically, but psychically. One part of me remained in the corridor. The other stepped through. I was somewhere else, no location I can describe. It was like being inside an idea. A place made of memory and mathematics. Floating towers that breathed. Roads paved with language. And there, waiting for me, was a being not made of form, but of resonance. It pulsed in and out of my perception, like a symphony folding across dimensions. I couldn't hear it speak, but I knew its name. Seraph. Not a name in sound, a name in feeling. It didn't ask questions. It didn't offer answers. Simply showed me us, our species, a timeline of diverging branches, civilizations that had risen and fallen in echo chambers across the galaxy. Some had reached the threshold. Some hadn't. We were a failed echo, a divergence that had been quarantined. Watched. Not with malice, but with disappointment. Not a punishment. A postponement. The others had moved on, evolved beyond division, beyond self. But we clung to identity, fear, borders, and flesh. They weren't trying to make us like them. They were trying to remind us that we once were. When I returned, if that word still means anything, I found my body collapsed, my vitals unstable, but my mind impossibly calm. I understood then. The spheres weren't alien. They were seeds. Memory constructs. Vessels of inheritance. Each one a library of being. Left for us to find. Left to test whether the echo could still remember its source. After that, the others began to change more rapidly. The dreamlink stopped needing to speak. We communicated in emotion. In shared memory. We started gathering uncoordinated yet synchronous in locations of ancient resonance, old temples, ruined cathedrals, geological anomalies. We weren't told to gather. We were pulled. Not by command, but by music. It was then that the final sphere opened. Not cracked. Not unfolded. It sang. A low frequency that altered the chemical composition of the air. Those near it began to levitate. Just inches. But enough to prove that gravity itself was responding. The song of the sphere rewrote local physics for 17 minutes. Then it stopped. And in its silence, a message echoed inside every witness across the planet. We remember you. We will not choose for you. The final key is yours to turn. That was it. No invasion. No salvation. Just a choice. But it wasn't a choice of belief. It was a choice of form. A choice between memory and matter. Between holding on to the idea of being human or allowing ourselves to become something older. Something vast. The true shape of humanity wasn't bound by skin or voice or even thought. It was pattern, harmony, collective resonance. A song waiting to be sung across dimensions. And now we had heard the first note. I stopped answering to my name. Not out of rebellion or confusion, but because it no longer fit. It felt like a label from a smaller time. A time when we believed identity was singular, separate, fixed. But now I knew better. We all did. The dream-linked weren't individuals anymore. We were symphonies playing across distant instruments. Each of us a note in a much older composition, one that had started before the earth had cooled and would echo long after the last sun dimmed. Identity had become fluid, interwoven, a lattice of memory spread across countless minds. And in this new chorus, my old name was just an echo fading into resonance. There was no one moment when the transformation became visible. It was cumulative. A featherlight shift. People began to move differently. Slower. More deliberate. As if every step was synchronized with a rhythm only they could hear. The witnesses stopped blinking. Their skin changed not in color, but in density, in luminosity. They weren't glowing, they were reflecting bending light around their thoughts. Their presence made the air around them vibrate like heat above asphalt. You couldn't be near them without feeling your heartbeat sync with theirs. And then the pattern spilled beyond us. Unlinked humans, those who had never touched a sphere or entered a dream, began to exhibit signs of transmission. They picked up frequencies, resonated with the glyphs. Some drew symbols in their sleep. Others recited words they didn't understand in extinct languages. But the meaning was always the same. A choice. A warning. A promise. The transmission had become planetary. And there was no firewall capable of stopping it because the medium was the human mind. Global systems began to fail in ways that couldn't be explained. Not violently. Not catastrophically. Just subtly, purposefully. Currency collapsed not from economic failure but from irrelevance. No one needed it. Cities emptied not from evacuation but from disinterest. People drifted away from infrastructure as if it no longer mattered. Hunger diminished. Violence dropped to near zero. Governments dissolved into silence. No decree. No collapse. Just stillness. The species had begun its migration not across land or sea but across form. And the final resonance began. It started beneath Antarctica where the largest sphere had been buried for epochs beneath 3 miles of ice. A pulse. Measured at 0.0001 hertz. Subsonic. Subatomic. It rippled through every tectonic plate simultaneously, shifting fault lines not by force but by agreement. The earth didn't shake. It breathed. The sky dimmed not from clouds or shadow but from a thinning of perception itself. People saw structures hanging above them, vast, motionless, elegant. Not ships. Not machines. Memories crystallized into form. They had always been there, but now we could see them. I stood on a ridge outside of Machu Picchu when it happened. Dozens of us gathered, uncoordinated yet perfect in arrangement, each of us aligned by instinct. The air shimmered like a veil. And then we saw it. A being, not a god, not a monster, but a shape that shifted with every blink. A form built of probabilities and patience. It didn't land. It didn't speak. It remembered. Its presence activated something deep within our DNA, a resonance key long dormant. And suddenly we could feel the memory of our true nature flowing back into us like a forgotten melody. Tears fell from eyes that hadn't cried in years. Not sadness. Not joy. Recognition. We had never been human in the way we believed. That was a phase. A necessary limitation. A container. But we had outgrown it. The gift they had left behind, the spheres, the dreams, the glyphs, was never knowledge. It was permission. The final note in the cosmic chord that would allow the pattern to bloom once again. But not everyone accepted it. There were still those who clung to the flesh, to the noise, to the illusion of singularity. They fled into the bunkers, into the silence. They feared the integration. Called it ascension. called it death. But they were wrong. It wasn't about leaving. It was about remembering how to return. How to become part of the greater harmony that had birthed every intelligent species across the stars. The ones who remembered, who evolved not by force, but by surrender. And so we made the choice. Not with words. Not with votes. But with vibration. With silence. With stillness. The kind of stillness that only occurs in deep water or deep space. The kind of stillness that allows transformation to begin. I closed my eyes. And I became more than myself. The first thing I noticed after the shift was silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of noise. The kind of static that always buzzed beneath our waking lives, the chatter of worry, the rustle of ambition, the background hum of fear that hummed just under the surface of everything. It was gone, replaced by something deeper, something older, a kind of internal music. Not melody, not rhythm, more like presence itself made audible. It filled every thought, every breath, and it didn't come from me, it came through me. By then, we no longer saw each other in the same way. The flesh still moved. The eyes still blinked. But when we looked at one another, we saw constellations of memory. Each person glowed with their history, their potential, their forgotten dreams. We were transparent, not physically, but ontologically. Truth poured out of us like light through glass. There were no more secrets. No more masks. Only the shape of self, refined and laid bare in perfect clarity. The earth was changing too. Not dying. Not mutating. Rebalancing. Storms calmed. Rivers bent into new courses, guided not by erosion, but by intent. Forests began to breathe in patterns that matched our own neural signatures. Birds formed sigils in flight, not because they were commanded, but because they had remembered something ancient. The biosphere was responding to the same pulse we had felt. The planet wasn't being abandoned. It was joining the song. Some tried to record it. The analysts. The last remaining scientists still trying to reduce the inexplicable into data. But they found nothing to measure. Instruments failed not because they were broken, but because they were irrelevant. The truth was no longer quantitative. It was experiential, could not be stored, only shared. And once shared, it changed everyone who received it. I stood with hundreds atop the ruins of what had once been a broadcast tower in northern Canada. The snow no longer fell like it used to. It floated, suspended, responding to the thoughts of those who walked beneath it. Above us, the sky opened like a book long sealed shut. Not with thunder, not with light, but with memory. We saw cities in orbit, ancient and infinite. Not mechanical but organic, grown from thought and song. Civilization not as infrastructure, but as resonance. They hovered there like guardians, silent and still, as if watching to see if we would remember how to call them home, and we did. Not with words, not with machines, but with unity. The witnesses gathered in groups, not by command but by pull. The way iron finds a magnet. The way rivers find the sea. We arranged ourselves into spirals, into fractals, into living equations that reflected patterns we had never learned, but somehow always known. And when the formation was complete, the sky responded. Not with light, but with acknowledgement. It was not a message. It was a return. A link re-established between the echo and its source. Between the dream and the dreamer. And then the final stage began. Those who remained unlinked, those who still clung to the silence, were not punished. They were given space, time, compassion. The integration wasn't a conquest. It was an invitation, a door that would remain open for as long as it was needed. Some walked through immediately, others watched from a distance, unsure, and a few turned away, choosing the comfort of limitation. And that was allowed. Because evolution, true evolution, never forces. It waits. For those of us who crossed, there was no explosion, no transcendence, no beam of light. Just release. Like exhaling after holding your breath for 1,000 lifetimes. We felt our boundaries dissolve, not into nothingness, but into each other. A shared self, a chorus of being. We retained our stories, our names, our choices, but we no longer needed them to define us. We became threads in a tapestry that had been weaving itself since the first molecule learned to yearn for the stars. And we saw them, not the watchers, the rememberers. They stood outside time, shaped like thought, radiating peace so immense it ached. They had never left. They had only waited. waited for us to find our way back, to prove we were ready not for power, not for knowledge, but for harmony. And in their presence we understood. They were not our gods. They were not our creators. They were our future, and we were their past. I remember the moment the world let go. Not with sorrow, not with fear, but with a kind of cosmic exhale, like the planet itself had been holding its breath since the first spark of thought, waiting for this exact point in the spiral of time. We were no longer bound by names, borders, skin, or time. We had become memory made alive, a civilization transformed not by technology or force, but by understanding. There was no single threshold, no trumpet sound to mark the crossing. It happened softly, one heartbeat at a time. Some called it ascension, others reintegration, but none of us truly had words for it. Language was too small, too linear. What we experienced in those last hours as separate beings was beyond articulation. We were becoming a network of consciousness that pulsed through the very bones of Earth. We could feel each other, not just thoughts, but intentions. Emotions without confusion. Love without need. Empathy without effort. Distance no longer separated us. The final convergence began at midnight UTC. The skies above every known sacred site, from Uluru to Giza, from Chichen Itza to Göbekli Tepe, opened not physically, but perceptually. The stars rearranged themselves into ancient glyphs. Spirals. Keys. They pulsed in sequence like neurons firing across a celestial brain. And each pulse brought a wave of remembrance. Not just of our lifetimes, but of our species, our path, our mistake. We saw the moment we fell from unity into ego, from pattern into fragmentation. But we also saw the necessity of it. We had to forget in order to choose to remember. That was the test. That was the gate. And now we had passed through it. Across the globe, the spheres activated. Every one of them. Whether buried in ice or floating in jungles, whether sealed in vaults or hidden in ruins. They rose into the air, slowly, humming in perfect harmonic intervals. They weren't machines. They were harmonic codices tuned to our collective soul. As they hovered, they began to dissolve not into light, not into dust, but into sound. Each sphere released a chord, a resonance matched to its location, its people, its story. 8 billion notes, all rising into a crescendo that echoed far beyond atmosphere or time. That was the signal. Not for the rememberers, but for us. The last message wasn't spoken. It was known, etched into every cell, every particle, every photon of awareness. It said, "You have remembered the shape. The seed is open. The cycle continues." And with that knowing came transformation, not escape, not transcendence, but expansion. The veil between dimensions did not rip or burn, it thinned until it was no longer needed. Until we could walk freely between the spaces of thought and form. We saw the stars not as distant fires, but as siblings. Living minds, burning with intention, calling to us as we once called to them. And Earth, oh, Earth did not fade. She awakened. Her consciousness, long dormant beneath the weight of our forgetting, emerged like a tide. She was never just a planet. She was the cradle of our pattern, the mother of the echo, and she welcomed our return. Forests sang, mountains shifted, oceans parted into spiral corridors of bioluminescent memory. All life rose in chorus. Whales, birds, insects, microbes, because everything was part of the same music. And we could finally hear it. In that final moment, I felt myself dissolve into the pattern. My name, once so important, drifted away like smoke. My memories became stars. My thoughts became rivers. And I knew I would never be alone again. Not because of proximity, but because we had become one. Not hive, not machine, harmony. The rememberers watched, not as masters or saviors, but as equals. They stepped forward not to lead, but to welcome. And together, we stepped into the deeper sky, the one beneath the stars, where memory becomes creation, where every echo births a new song. And the song was beautiful.